So we have science, and then we also have a kind of a natural human relationship, natural, with nature. And we also have stories that are like fairy tales about nature. And then we have the modern version of the fairy tale, which is the science fiction story. And I grew up with both fairy tales and science fiction stories. But compared to fairy tales, science fiction stories were, for me, perhaps especially as a boy in our culture, and in the birth of the technological age, science fiction, in most cases, radically outperformed fairy tales in terms of being exciting, fascinating, thought-provoking, astonishing, and inspiring. And so I read a great deal of science fiction when I was a young man, and was fascinated with the ideas of what the future might look like and become, and what we might discover about what it means and doesn't mean, what it might mean and shouldn't mean for us to be human. And for me, science fiction was a kind of prophetic window where the finest minds who could see into the nature of our relationships with language and technology, ideas and nature, the sky, our origins, and the future, could safely pursue their most fervent and impassioned senses and speculations, visions, really. They were prophets, it seemed to me. And then, as I got a little older, I began to encounter fantasy novels. And these were to have a similarly profound effect on my mind and psyche, but in a direction or in a dimension somewhat complementary to that of science and technology and science fiction and its promises of space travel, contact with other intelligences, the discovery of our origins, and things like that. So science fiction kind of held out these particular promises, right? That we could travel instantaneously through space, that we could, unfortunately, engage in wars with strange other alien creatures and intelligences and situations, that we could explore and learn about the nature of the universe in radical, amazing ways that were adventurous and exciting and dangerous and deceptive. And whereas fairy tales held more of a promise of discovering the origins of our souls and the landscape of something like communion, but always masquerading as magic. And so on the one hand, if, I was a kid and I wanted to live out the fantasies in a fantasy novel, I would want a culture and a role and a situation in which I could learn myself and my own inner landscape and relationships, powers and abilities, in conflict with some dark force. And that there might be something like magical artifacts that represented the sole purposes of the true way, and that such artifacts could be of great aid in battles against darkness and such. This is kind of the basic theme of role-playing games and fantasy novels, although it's a basic theme. Sophisticated fantasy novels are far richer than this. So there were these sort of two paradigms, right? One was like, the universe is magic. There's a secret war. Somewhere there are magic artifacts that would be of great aid. And then on the other side is the universe is filled with alien intelligences, and the only way we can get to them is in spaceships, which are like cars that go between worlds. And or if they come to us. And of course, many of our ideas about that look like they come to us to destroy us. So, we have these two sorts of fairy tales, and the fascinating thing is that neither of them are much like the world. They're both sort of overlays. And isn't it interesting that we have overlays between us and what's actually right here? Because whatever it is that's actually right here must be so much astonishingly more, it's my neighbor's dryer, than any of those overlays, right? Because they must be derivatives of it. The little ideas and games we make up in words and language and concepts, the stories we tell, the movies we watch and adore, the passionate epics that lift us for a moment to memory of the highest aspirations and virtues, potentials, and futures of our birth as human beings, the pictures and stories that we read that excite and enthrall, surprise and frighten us, must be much less, much less, right, than the two domains, or three really, that they're concerned with. And those three domains are human culture, nature, and the sky, right? These are the three domains we're concerned with. All of our stories take place in these three sort of settings. So the funny one is that we're making toys that look more advanced than ordinary reality right outside your door. But this is deceptive, and it's terrifyingly deceptive, because we're actually doing it because for the reason that the reality near at hand is so much more than either of those stories, that we're both unwilling, unaccustomed, and intimidated by the possibility of encountering it. So that, for example, if we want to meet the spirits of nature, and we are modern, Western young men and women, we might travel in an airplane down to South America and then enter essentially a poisoning crisis with a psychedelic drug to produce a death-like, an encounter with death, essentially, that will force the aspect of ourselves that we have completely shut down, ignored, denied, and are there to ignore and deny some more in a new way. It will force that aspect into explicit expression. And we will have no choice but to have a very peculiar glimpse under a very strange series of circumstances of something we will not understand. And we will not understand the context of this experience in general. And the experience will not provide that. So our whole culture is kind of like this. We're trying to produce these situations where we don't want to actually enter the ordinary reality right here together. The flower in front of you, and that little that little thing is about to become very significant, that flower in front of you. But I want to kind of try to do the opposite. I want to attempt a very dangerous thing. I want us to try to see together for a moment why we have these stories and what they're standing in front of, what they're making invisible to us. And what I'm going to say might sound like a fairy tale, But in fact, it's the opposite. It's the origin of both of these stories. So on my back porch, there's across the tiny cement yard space underneath my porch, there's a garden. It's a very small garden by some standards. It belongs to my neighbor, Eva. She is an elderly woman, about, oh, I don't know. Well, she's advanced in age, let us say this. And she can no longer tend her garden, so others tend it for her. And it's very humble. It's an urban backyard garden. When I was a child, I wanted a magic artifact that would at once teach me and help me to become, how shall we put it, a true person, a good and noble being, somehow, against all odds, against even many of my own inclinations. Yeah? And I also wanted and hoped for the chance to have something like an intelligent spaceship, right? Not just a spacecraft that could take me to any world, but a spacecraft that was a companion, that was itself a form of intelligence. Yeah? Because by myself with a spaceship, how would I know where to go? Right? I'd need a spaceship that understood the dimension and network of the betweens of worlds and living hypersystems of minds, of living worlds. I need something native to that hypersystem, that network. It's not a network, though. To travel in, right? So the fact that you've discovered an ocean and can make a boat is not very interesting. An ocean is very big. You have to know where to go. Right? It's also very dangerous and extremely unpredictable and filled with novelty. So again, a spaceship wouldn't help you much and would probably get you in a lot of trouble because human minds tend to have very confusing and very ironic desires. So I'd always hoped for some chance to meet the magic, right? Or to learn why we had all those stories. Or to meet an intelligence from another world. Possibly, I guess I imagine, like everyone, they might arrive in a spacecraft, huh? Or a disc-shaped craft, like those we've heard of, and those that have fascinated me in science fiction since childhood. Yeah? So I had these ideas. They weren't unreasonable because they were from the culture, right? They were from that overlay of culture. They weren't from the sky, and they weren't from nature. And by the way, the books we have about the sky, those books are called religions, right? So the sky books are called religions. The nature books are called fantasies, and the human cultural technological books are science fiction, right? Of course, they all mix together. None of them are explicitly distinct. And yet, the sky books claim explicit distinction. The Bible and the Quran, the other holy books, they claim an explicit distinction above all stories. Yeah? They claim something like divine verity. Now, interestingly, so too do certain aspects of science do this. They claim kind of extreme verity. These are the truth. So I got the idea that the road into space was based on machines and science. The way into nature was probably based on some kind of magic. And the way into culture was the mastery of technology, methods, and systems, ideas, language, math, physics, computing. And I think a lot of people probably have similar, experiences to me, and they oriented toward one of these features, right? They oriented toward the sky books, toward the fantasy books or toward the culture artifacts and imperatives. And of course, there's a terrible conflict between all these three, right? And then there's a very small number of people who kind of went right to nature, too, and wrote and lived about that. So we'll include them. And here's the ironic thing that I never would have guessed. And it's going to sound a little bit confusing at first, I'm sure. In fact, to be quite frank, I'm desperately trying to figure out how to communicate this clearly, because it's just not going to make much sense in ordinary language. But that little garden outside my back porch is more than all those things I wanted and thought. And it's right here with me. It's not far away. It's more than all of the fantasies, all of the technology. It's more than all the science fiction. It's more than the Lord of the Rings. It's more. It keeps being more in a way that's impossible to understand. And there's something really hilarious about this, because, first of all, the way in which this is true is invisible to our ordinary ways of thinking, right? And because we can't think this way, we're in a strange position where we're not likely to notice, right? And we're likely to see and think in all the overlays we've been taught from culture that have divorced us from our humanity and kind of placed us in a really peculiar disembodied mind, right? Where we're choosing between fictions and how to emulate and impersonate and personate in all these little overlays and fictions and things. So when we look at the garden, we don't actually have any idea what we're looking at. And if we did for a moment, which is my hope, that we might begin to get a more interesting idea of what we're looking at, part of the reason that we don't is that it would be terrifying. It would be so beyond anything that we've ever imagined possible that the structure of our mind would have difficulty surviving it. There would be the incipient threat of madness. Because if all of the things in all of those stories were less by far than your relationship with that garden right now, and you suddenly felt and knew and could see all the ways in which that was true and could be and act in those ways, unlike being and acting in any of the fictional overlays of our culture that replace our humanity and relationships with nature, if you got a taste of that even for a moment, it would be so shocking, it would destroy everything you'd ever thought about identity, meaning, value, what a person is, what an animal is, everything. It would completely wipe that out with something so shocking that just to stand in it for even a moment is a terrifying ecstasy that most would flee from the face of. And that would have to be true. Because if nature's more than all of the fantasies and all of the science fiction, if already in a flower is more than everything that machines can ever be, and you have direct access to that because you are the same kind and way of being, you're actually extensions of one another, you and this flower. If that were true, right, then everything humans modernly believe and think and do, and everything they've done in the past, and all the stories and all the books would be shown to have been exactly wrong in explicitly the opposite direction of what's right in front of us. And our mind, like just your ego mind, yourself, your person, the way you think, it doesn't want to approach any threat like that ever. That's actually why people go to great extremes, like flying down to South America and inducing a psychedelic death crisis, which will give them far less than what I'm talking about, far, far less than what I'm talking about. That's why they'll do that. They want to have the thing that, well, it's vaguely similar, but it'll fit in my paradigm. It'll fit into how I think about the world and myself, life and death, value, objects, animals. It'll fit in. It won't obliterate it, right? Because if it did, none of those people would ever come back. Right? And they couldn't, they better not have jobs or families or anything in the world, because they just wouldn't be able to function. So you can see what I'm implying here so far, and it is this. That little garden, and I don't mean in ideas or concepts, I mean directly, accessibly, the way you can drink water, is a door. And the door leads to the origins of everything. And it's not a network. It's something we don't have a name for. I don't even want to call it a network because we've got the wrong idea about what a network is. But if you understand that a network is a derivation of a mind, or a brain, right? A network is a mechanical derivation of a living, organismal, yeah, what is that? Now I'm in trouble. System of relations that extends beyond the body, that is localized as the brain, right? So a network is an abstraction of that idea, a mechanical abstraction. What you've got in the garden is essentially like a synapse, yeah? In a brain that has multiple orders of brain-likeness, yeah? And that synapse has entrance portals. And what they open onto is a mode of flowing. A mode of flowing where an aspect of your being, right, that is made to know and travel in this system of relationships, yeah, this hyper system of minds and beings, an aspect of your being that is made to travel there recognizes those doors, yeah? But your thinking mind is not. And in fact, just to continue going on as the thinking mind and self that you're familiar with, it has to explicitly not recognize those and give you stories and adventures and things that, you know, give you a little bit of the thrill of what it might be like to have a first-person experience instead of that of a spectator, right? To be the protagonist rather than to observe them. That mind explicitly avoids contact with those portals, if you will. And when you dream, you're kind of in a flowing mind. Identity is flowing. It's very flow-oriented. It's really hard to distinguish things in dreaming in the way that we think about those experiences once we are awake. In dreaming, gender is sort of fuzzy. Boy can be a girl inside. Lots of different things can happen. So in dreaming, there's sort of a flow-like aspect to meaning, movement, relation, and identity. And the flow-like aspect has precedence. And you can feel the loss of this flow-like aspect when you awaken from the dream. You'll feel like everything was sort of flowing togetherly connected, and it felt so amazing. And now it's kind of like I'm in a photograph, right? It's kind of like I'm in a frozen version of that where only I am moving. It used to be that everything was flowing and moving. Now only I am moving and everything is kind of static and doesn't have anything in it, right? So the flowing in the dream is relational. It's kind of like an intimacy liquid, right, that is exchanged. And it's not the words or gestures, it's not the plot, it's something deeper, right? It's the relational exchanges and their many domains of meaning. It's very much a flowing experience. And it's funny because we think of our... there's a whole story in the Bible about Adam and Eve at the tree, right? they have some problem, they get in trouble with an angel, they acquire some way of seeing. Very interesting, this. And then in response, when God returns, they hide their flowers. Isn't that interesting? And they hid their flowers with the leaf, at least in some versions of the story, with the leaf of a fig tree. It happens to be the only tree in nature whose flower is invisible, microscopic, can't be seen with the human eye. And so one of the things I want you to just simply understand, without really knowing what to do with it yet, is that when you're looking at the little garden, every place you see a flower, that's a portal into the origin of life. And you're born to travel into the web that portal leads into with an aspect of yourself that you're only familiar with from dreaming. And when you're awake, this aspect is nearly frozen and practically holding its breath. And it's aching for a moment to travel, to flow again. And isn't it ironic that in English, the actual name of the portals in the garden is flower. And we know that our genitalia are flowers. It's quite fiercely obvious, not a metaphor, yes? But what we have forgotten is that above and behind, before and around that physical flower, and the feelings and urges that orient us with that flower, almost like as if it were a compass, drawing us and repulsing us and into orbits and encounters, yes? Behind all of culture is this flower, these flowers and this relationship, yeah? Underneath everything we do, our language, everything, our relationship with these flowers, which Adam and Eve, apparently in the story we all know, hid after the accident. Why did they do that? They had learned something that they couldn't unlearn. But what I want to get at is this: those flowers between our legs are like the fingernail of a butterfly. And that butterfly changes and flows and has capacities that make what we can do with the flowers between our legs seem relatively trivial. That butterfly, a flowing, changing aspect of yourself that is known to you from dreams but alien to your waking life, and is the origin of all those stories and the sky books and the science fiction books and the culture itself, all of these things, that creature is meant to travel in and as the between of beings and the intelligences and forms of intelligence that dwell and learn and develop there. And when you see flowers, you're looking at the portal, and when you give them or love them, that's the door, but you've got it wrong if you think that the object is the interesting thing. Now, if this is true, or something like this is true, right, then what I'm saying is more than all of the magical objects and curses and spells and situations in all of human fantasy, and more than the wildest presentations of all of science fiction, including all possible contact with all possible intelligences, that every flower you see is the gateway to something far beyond those stories. And you were made and born to know and travel in it as your own being, not as a spectator to stories about it. And that fact is so terrifying and so shocking and so filled with promise that all of the cultures on Earth have done everything they can to make that impossible in language, concept, action, thought. We've poisoned the pollens, right? We never understood in looking at the garden what the bees represented. And this butterfly, this creature inside you that travels, it's a pollen-like creature. It can turn into a flowing dust and go into any doorway and travel in and as the living hypersystem from which minds emerge, from which the forms of life emerge. And it is this you were born for, and it is this possibility that every flower faces, if you will but recognize that you inside have no identity, no face. You are a flower. You are a flower. And when you recognize in nature the likeness of that aspect, you will flow into it. Yes? And in this moment, something beyond anything I can ever hope to speak of or point at or frame to you will be remembered, and you will never forget. And the stories may still be interesting, but when you see a flower, you will remember and know how to use and learn the portal that leads to where we come from, where our minds originate, what these languages are derivatives of little pieces of. And you'll probably, at that point, gain some very peculiar insights into the overlays we produce as human culture, why we make the stories, and what we might do instead that's so much more interesting that it might just be possible that no one would ever write another book, because what we'd be doing and living would make such books superfluous.